I'm Leah Lane, an award-winning travel writer and author of Places I Remember, Tales, Truths, Delights from 100 Countries. On this podcast, we share conversations with travelers about fascinating destinations and memorable experiences around the world. One motto that applies to a road trip: you may have destinations in mind, but adventure truly lies in the journey. And that's one of the great things about a road trip. You never know what you'll find along the way, and you have the independence to stop and enjoy it. Our guest today is Cary Lane. He's a college professor, an artist, a museum curator, and my son. Welcome, Cary.
Thank you very much for having me here. I'm very, very excited, and this is your new podcast, and I couldn't be more proud of you. This was a really wonderful trip that we took, and it's a pleasure for me to reflect on it with you.
Great. It'll be fun. For a big birthday, my husband Bill and I took Cary and his lovely significant other, Zhanna, on a road trip. Cary's a history buff, especially about the world wars of the 20th century. So what would be a better place to travel than the battlefields of World War I and World War II in France and Belgium? And along with the historic sites, we visited some of the loveliest towns and cities in Europe, including Bruges, Belgium, Rouen, and Honfleur in France, and we ended in Paris. First, we'll talk a little bit about planning a road trip and how to make it work. Planning helps you to have time to find surprises later. You want to be realistic about your time. Leave enough. You don't want to drive more than maybe 4 hours a day if possible. And you want to leave time for the unexpected. Think about if you have enough time to do what you want. If not, you'll have to shorten your goals or add some time or move along faster.
I thought it was great. I thought we blended well together, and I think that when you travel in a group, communication is key. Everybody had a nice tempo, and we went with the flow. And if somebody wanted to do something, we did it. And if somebody didn't, we didn't. And sometimes we split off into groups. So I thought it was we had a nice chemistry together.
Great. We designed the trip for minimal unpacking. We were using our car and maybe some trains. And we figured we'd have many stops. And we had daylight until about 9 p.m. It was the summer, so that helped a lot. You want to plan a goal. Make sure you can write your theme of the trip in a sentence. So I would say that on this trip, we toured France and Belgium, driving through the regions of Picardy, Flanders, Normandy, and Paris. And we focused on the wars of the 20th century and cultural and historical discoveries and good food. So that was what we were trying for. And I think if you can write it down, it helps you to keep your goal in mind.
I would just say, and even you had the little phrase, beaches and trenches. And I remember when we landed at Charles de Gaulle, there you are with that, with your sign, the Beaches and Trenches tour. And I knew we were in great hands.
Right. I thought that was sort of the theme. I guess that was the better theme than the longer theme. You want to consider your transportation carefully and book ahead if possible, depending on how many of you there are, the size you need, the comfort you need. Consider the ease of driving and cost of gas. Do you want an RV? Do you want an SUV, a sports car, a convertible?
Okay, well, we had 4 people and 4 people of various sizes, and we had luggage for 2 weeks. So we needed something sizable, a drivable car, and we needed GPS navigation. And we wanted to make sure it was comfortable. So when we landed at Charles de Gaulle, we went to the Avis and we tried a couple of different cars before. It was like the 3 little bears. Did our luggage fit? Yes. Did we fit? Yes. Is it a drivable car? Yes. And so we ended up with a Volvo 4-door station wagon. Very large, almost like a hearse in its size, but it was very drivable, and we drove a lot. That was key. So the car really was great.
Great. Okay, what about the lodgings? You want to book at least your first and last lodgings, preferably all of them.
Well, we stayed at many different places, and we went with a more adventurous sort of itinerary where we moved more frequently than stayed in one place. I believe you called the hub and spoke method.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, so we went with a more asymmetrical route. So we tried, many different hotels and B&Bs, and some were great and some we missed a little bit, which we'll get into. But doing the research ahead of time, I think, is the key to success in this case.
Yeah, we tried to stay at least 2 nights when we were traveling, because you can arrive sometime on the first day and get settled. And then you have a full day to explore. and then return at night, get a good night's sleep, which you need, and then you'll depart refreshed the next day. So that was our goal. Sometimes we stayed even longer than 2 days or 2 nights. And we tried to stay close to the center when we wanted to walk around to save time and effort and money. We did try to choose hotels with lots of reviews. Otherwise, you're sort of on your own, but you have to be a little bit skeptical. Do you want to tell us a little story, Cary?
The only hotel we had problems with was one where we couldn't really vet it as much as other places because this was a newer bed and breakfast. This was in the town of Bayeux near the Normandy beaches. And this was about a week after the 75th anniversary of D-Day. So there weren't that many available lodgings. And we actually got this place because one, it was available when other places were not. And two, even though it was new and not well reviewed, it was on the pricier side. We assumed that it was going to be of a quality that we wouldn't have to worry about. But it turns out, despite the charm of the city and actually the charm of the building, that our accommodations were a bit moldy and stuffy, and there were no windows in the room that you were staying in, Leah. And so I guess the moral of the story is do try and vet your lodgings using TripAdvisor or some of the other review websites.
Right. I could add a little bit to that. The room that Bill and I had was a store. It was a store. We walked into an art store and we looked in and we said, "Where's our room?" And the proprietor said, "This is your room." And she took us to the back of the store where there was no windows or anything. And during the day, people would look through the windows and, they'd see us inside the room. And it was the oddest hotel room I'd ever been in. It was the most expensive hotel on our whole trip. So you do want to watch the reviews and be careful about that. It was a good story afterwards, at least. How about restaurants? You have to eat when you travel on a road trip. I would say you want to eat where the locals do, if possible. And if you can picnic where it's a beautiful area, that's a wonderful thing to do on the road as well.
And you're in the French and Belgian countryside, and it's a lot of farm to table and a lot of local chefs. We relied on Yelp a lot. We took chances with places, and again, it's going to be hit or miss, but for the most part, I thought the food was amazing. The meat that you're eating is usually raised locally, and the wine is local, and they're growing the pears and the apples, and they make Calvados locally, wonderful. There were maybe one or two duds that we had in the entire trip. One time we were in Lille, and we were coming back from a day in the touring the battlefields of World War I, and it was very late, and we were near the main square in Lille, and we saw a bistro, and it looked perfect. It was like something out of the Belle Epoque, and it was sort of this traditional French bistro, and it ended up, despite the ambiance and despite its look and feel, it ended up being maybe, I don't know, it was one of the worst coq au vins I've ever. It was dry chicken, and really, it wasn't good. But the ambiance, that we were so disappointed because the look and felt the part. But you're going to have that in a 2-week trip, and that's part of the charm too. And we're talking about that meal, and maybe not some of our better ones. That's part of the adventure.
Well, it sure is. And eating is one of the five senses, and you want to use all of your five senses on a road trip. I remember seeing the most beautiful poppy fields and listening to the birds and feeling the hot sun and talking to the locals. So you really get to know a place when you're on the road, and that was one of the best parts of a road trip. I would say the last thing to think about is to be very thoughtful when you're on a road trip, when you're sharing, driving, navigating. You want to think of others' needs and their quirks and how many pit stops you have and first aid. You want to get up on time, be on time. And sometimes you take breaks from each other. You have some downtime, and we did lots of that. So I think, generally speaking, wherever you go on any road trip, these are things you can think about. But let's talk about the pleasures of our road trip, June 2019, our trip through France and Belgium. Let's just go through it and talk about it a little specifically, some of the wonderful places we experienced. We came out of de Gaulle Airport in Paris on a very sunny morning, and we drove through the area of Picardy, where there are many World War II battles. We were going to find the railroad car where the armistice was signed. There were two armistices signed. They are actually for World War I and World War II. And we thought this would tie the whole trip together, starting with the car where these armistices were signed. But guess what? We couldn't find it. So what happened, Cary?
Well, I think it was also a case of, we had just gotten off a red eye, and we had just rented a new car, and I think at that point, most of us were thinking about craving a meal and a bed. So, these are going to be, maybe we were a little ambitious about trying to do too much too quickly after just arriving from our long flight. And again, but that's part of rolling with the punches. And sometimes you're going to think you're going to do something, you end up doing another thing. The downside of that is like during that day, I remember we were so tired that we programmed the GPS in the wrong direction and we drove 2 hours out of our way one way and we had to drive 2 hours back. So on top of all the travel and the sightseeing that first day, we ended up taking a 4-hour detour because of the language barrier with the GPS.
Yep, it was not a good start. However, we saw some pretty little agricultural towns, and we got over it. We had a very good night's sleep, and our first stop in Lille, which is a very underrated city in northern France in the Flanders area, where we stayed for 3 nights. We stayed near the train station in downtown because we thought we might take a train to Ghent or maybe Brussels. But we decided instead to sleep in, I guess, because of our first day. So we just explored the area a little bit. And then we took a full day to visit our first World War I battlefields around Ypres, which is a beautiful medieval town from the Middle Ages, which was a major cloth weaving city. And it has a beautiful square, and it's a wonderful thing to visit just for itself. It had a museum there of the Great War, and we started with that. So we got an overview of what we were going to see. And we even got a map, which we took with us. And again, when we were on a road trip, we could do what we wanted, be independent, stop and start when we wanted. And we took this map and we drove around. How would you describe the drive?
Oh, the drive around the battlefield is haunting, and you can feel the sort of presence. And I think one of the ways that you feel it is because of just the number of memorials that there are. The Western Front was a very narrow swath. It didn't really waver more than 10, 15, 20 miles, but it was really long. It was stretching from northern Belgium all the way down to the Swiss border. Along this swath on the Western Front, I mean, there are hundreds of cemeteries and memorials. And so as you're driving around the battlefield, it's really the memorials that you ended up stopping for. And some of these memorials and cemeteries are just dark and beautiful and haunting and well maintained. And the Tyne-Cot Cemetery, in particular, with British and Australian soldiers, beautiful, really. And so you really have this feeling. It's sort of, you internalize it because there's something in the air. As you're touring, you feel it. And then, of course, the poppy fields, as you mentioned, which is also a symbolic reminder. So you can't go really very far without being reminded of the history, and it sort of goes inside of you.
Yeah, it's really moving. We made sure to be back at Ypres for a ceremony at the Menin Gate. The Menin Gate is a memorial that bears the names of more than 54,000 British and Commonwealth officers and men whose graves are not known. And every night at 7 p.m., people gather at this gate. You want to get there early if you want to have the best impression of what goes on. You want to describe what that is?
Oh, yeah, it was. It's a 9-minute ceremony, and I ended up videotaping it. As you said, Leo, I got there an hour ahead while you and Bill got a cup of Belgian coffee or hot chocolate. There are 200 to 300 people who gather every night at 7 p.m. And the night we were there, it was raining, but we were protected under this arch. And it's a very moving ceremony with local veterans groups, local military, and a drum corps and bugleists, and they let the travelers who visit help lay the wreath. And so it's a very moving ceremony, and just the idea that they do this every night and have done so every night since the end of the war is very striking.
Yeah, it's very beautiful. The next day, we drove to someplace else that's beautiful, Bruges, Belgium. Now, I had written about Bruges for Photo's Guidebook, so I knew about it and been there before. And I can say it's still beautiful, but the crowds are intense. So we got there midday, and we walked around the cobbled streets and looked at the canals, and we went to the Berg Square and the City Hall with its ornate ceiling and the Market Square with its 13th century belfry. And it was very beautiful, but the crowds were overwhelming. So we decided to stay late and have dinner there. And then after dinner, we walked out, and what a difference it makes.
Beautiful when you have the town to yourself like that. And one of the best things in Bruges are the artisan chocolatiers. And so they have dozens of artisan chocolatiers making wonderful chocolates. We made the mistake of actually not buying enough chocolate. We were thinking, oh, we'll save our appetite for dinner. And then we regretted it later that we didn't buy enough chocolate. So when you go to Bruges and you buy their chocolates, which are fantastic, do buy enough and take a few boxes with you because you'll want them later.
That's an excellent suggestion.
who,
And I
who
would say
doesn't
have
buy enough? Who doesn't buy enough chocolate at the best chocolatiers in the world?
I know we were foolish, but we did have. I think we had fries, didn't we? I mean, you have to have the fries with the mayo,
Yeah,
of
the
course, the
free, free.
chocolate. Frites,
Yeah.
right? We say frites. So then we moved. We stayed 2 nights in another city in France, in Amiens, and that's a regional city. It's a university city. It has a gorgeous Gothic cathedral. It's the tallest cathedral in France, and from the 13th century. And they light it up in the summer. We just missed the lighting, but it was so beautiful inside. And they have floating gardens and canals all the way through in one area that you take a little barge and you go and float along. It's very unusual. Did you like that?
It's a tributary of the Somme River.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because we were in the Somme area. You don't think of that so much when you're in the battlefield area, but yes, that's a tributary of the Somme. It's a very nice city. So we were there 2 nights, and one day we took another full day to drive around the Somme area where there were battlefields. And how would you describe this area, Cary?
It's been 100 years since this war, and so you kind of have to use your imagination a little bit, because although you're standing on a demarcated battlefield, there oftentimes isn't as much in terms of remaining artifacts or barbed wire or trenches which have been filled in or eroded. But there are scars on the land, hills which are either cratered because of artillery. We visited a huge bomb crater. You sort of can envision what this stalemate of the two sides in the trench warfare was. It's these cemeteries adjacent to all the battlefields that really puts it into context in terms of scale. The Tancot Cemetery, I think, being the feature one in the Somme, in the Ypres and in the Somme area.
Yeah, I think when you drive along this beautiful agricultural area, it's so calm and peaceful. It's hard to realize that one of the largest battles of World War One, among the bloodiest in all of human history, was right there. I think there were more than 57,000 casualties of British forces, including more than 19,000 soldiers killed on the first day of the battle alone, the single most disastrous day in that nation's military history. But the area today is lovely and calm, and it makes you think about many things and appreciate peace. There was a little museum in a town called Peronne, a little military museum, and it was quite striking.
They're modern and well appointed, and they open with a very fine film that really informs you about how complex and how brutal this World War One was, and how romanticized it was going in, and how brutal it was coming out, and senseless, really. So they really start you on with a wonderful film there. And they have fantastic artifacts that you can get very up close and personal with. And in the back, you can actually touch. This was a very nice museum. And we ran into so many different museums, large and small, and you kind of have to choose. And again, you have to do a little research, which are worth stopping at, and especially in the Normandy area, which we'll talk about. There's so many little museums, or people have 3 or 4 Sherman tanks and they call it a museum. Like the food or the lodging, the museums will be hit or miss. This one in Peronne was a good one.
Well, the next day we went on to Normandy, to Rouen, a beautiful, beautiful capital of the northern region of Normandy. It's on the River Seine, and it has a beautiful cathedral like so many other of these towns. But this one was painted often by Monet. You may have seen it in museums. It's shimmering and white. So we walked there. And we decided to have lunch at a very famous restaurant called La Couronne.
Hard to believe. It opened 80 years before Joan of Arc was burned at the stake. And it's actually 100 feet from where Joan of Arc was burned at the stake. So I don't know if they brought her there for her last meal, but if they did, it was open. So when you're eating in an 800-year-old restaurant, it's, this is a case where there's a little bit of hype to it, and it's going to be expensive because it's the oldest restaurant in France, but you do it anyway because it's the oldest restaurant in France.
Right.
What did they serve 800 years ago? And Julia Child ate there, and her pictures up there, and you have souffle and you have pâtés and poached fish, and very traditional. It was still a wonderful experience. And my seat was facing out I could see the little garden where the Joan of Arc where she met her demise. It was just, you feel the history. it doesn't get more traditional, obviously. It just lets you know these cathedrals and these restaurants are 800 to 1,000 years old, and a really wonderful experience. So this is a case where
sometimes it's worth it. I should say more than having lunch there, Julie Child was inspired by it. I think it was her first French meal. And she said, right then and there, I'm going to learn how to do this. And the rest is history of another sort. After that, we decided to add a little stop. This is a good thing about a road trip. We had a little time and the light was late, it was until 10. So we said, let's go on to the prettiest port in Normandy, to Honfleur. It's just a beautiful little old harbor with 16th to 18th century townhouses. Monet painted it and other painters. It's where the Seine meets the English Channel. And we just walked around, Zhanna and I did, and had a very nice, unexpected stop.
Yeah, it's very charming. And I remember taking a picture of you. You rode the carousel in the harbor, and we walked around the harbor, and everybody was having a drink outside. A lovely stop.
Yeah, we had a lot of serious things on this trip, and we went to many museums. This was just a joyful little stop, and I'm so glad we did it. We drove on a little bit more to Bayeux in Normandy. That is very close to Omaha Beach, where D-Day occurred June 6, 1944. It's a beautiful medieval town. We stopped there for 2 days.
Yeah. So again, we were there. We just happened to be there the week after the 75th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. And that means a week after all the leaders of the free world were there. So the grandstands were still there. And obviously the cemetery and surrounding areas were in immaculate shape. So we got to feel the anniversary without having to deal with the crowds. The Bayeux, the town we were staying, in honor of the 75th anniversary, every single storefront had a little sort of painting, "Thank you, America, thank you, Allies," with American soldiers painted. Nice to see this sort of throwback to when the American soldiers were respected in Europe. And, I'd never been to Normandy or Omaha Beach. I'd read Stephen
Yes,
Anderson.
you have, Cary. When you were a tiny baby, I took you in a stroller up the steps of Mont Saint Michel. So you don't remember?
What year was that?
Way back, right? 1970, 71, around then.
71. When you wind your way, you're driving through all the hedgerows and all the little towns that from Bayeux that the Allies fought after the beach invasion. And that's one of the things you actually notice when you go to the American cemetery is that the dates of death of the American soldiers aren't all June 6th, 1944. They're June 21st. They're July 4th, 1944. And so a lot of the casualties that the Allies experienced as they fought their way inland into the hedgerows, those soldiers also are buried in the American cemetery. But, like the bookend to the World War I cemeteries, which I think, the cemeteries and the memorials, I think, in this whole area is just really the standout. It's not even so much the battlefield per se. And we did walk down to the beach, Omaha Beach, and that does give you chills. And I couldn't help looking for artifacts myself. Will there be a piece of shrapnel here, 75 years later? I just couldn't help looking down at the sand, hoping to find a casing.
We did see something. Remember, there was something in the sand. It was heavy, so it probably couldn't have been moved easily.
Yeah. A lot of times they put a plaque on an immovable object, like a hunk of steel from, one of the German, fortifications. And if you're at the top of the hill, their German artillery guns are still in their pillboxes, and you get to go inside those pillboxes and overlook the beach. And so from the perspective of above the beach, especially at Pointe du Hoc, where the Army Rangers climbed the cliffs, the chalk cliffs, and heavy casualties, you saw it from the German perspective, you saw it from the American perspective when you were down on the beach, and how daunting that was. You have a lovely museum near the American Cemetery that we actually went to after we visited the cemetery. I would recommend actually going to the museum before you visit the cemetery to really they have, a lovely film to orient you and wonderful artifacts. And it's sort of to prepare you for what you're going to experience. Very sobering in current political climates. You see what's at stake, and it met expectation.
Yes, it did. The next day was our last day. We were going to take a train to Paris, but we changed our plans. Again, on a road trip, sometimes that happens. We decided we'd drive into Paris. So right before we did, Zhanna and I went to see the Tapestry of Bayeux, which is an 11th century tapestry. It's 204 feet long. It's absolutely beautiful. It depicts the 1066 Norman invasion of England, which kind of, makes you think about wars and how many invasions there have been. And it was quite something to see, and we were glad we stopped. And then we went on to Paris, and Cary did the driving. And would you like to describe what it was like on a Friday? I think it was a holiday as well. And we came onto the Champs-Élysées, and what happened?
I live in New York, and you think you can handle the traffic in Paris. If you can handle the New York traffic, you can handle the French traffic. And I did. Nothing bad happened, but it's quite an experience going around the Arc de Triomphe with 7 different merges. And yeah, I just remember that Paris is sort of the architecture in terms of the city planning is very complex. It's like a circle or it's like a wheel, and all roads lead to the center of the city. Well, here we are at the center of the city, and the roundabouts that you see in New England sort of don't do the justice of what this was.
It was something else.
Yeah, I decided that if they're going to hit me, they're going to hit me. I'm going to step on the gas, and we're going to make it through. And nobody hit us, and we made it in.
We made it in. It was exciting. I will say that.
Yeah.
I had my eyes closed most of the time.
And I know Bill had his eyes closed.
Oh, yeah. I think we all had you had your eyes open. You had to. But we got to our beautiful little hotel, Saint Paul Rive Gauche, a tiny little hotel on the left bank. And we stayed in Paris for a few days. And we sort of split up here because Zhanna had not been to Paris. And you took her around to some of the places she wanted to go to. And it was very nice. We met for dinner. And we sometimes were there for breakfast together, but we had our own alone time. And it was a lovely ending to the trip. And we're not going to go into Paris. We'll have another episode on Paris alone. We've already had our first episode on the left bank of Paris that I've already done, but we'll do more. But just to say, it was a beautiful ending to a magnificent trip. The name of the podcast is Places I Remember. And on this road trip, what's one of your favorite memories, Cary?
To me, as I was saying earlier, maybe one of the best parts of the experience were the memorials and cemeteries that were adjacent to the battlefields, not necessarily the battlefields themselves. Of the many cemeteries we went to, one of the more interesting ones was one of the Imperial German Army cemeteries I believe this was in the Somme, the Battle of the Somme. These German cemeteries were sort of much less traveled. There was nobody there. The crosses were very Spartan, dark, thin steel crosses, and very Germanic, very World War I, but very beautiful at the same time, just because of the contrast of, say, the sort of white memorials that the Allied countries' cemeteries have. These were black steel crosses. And we were in one German cemetery in particular in Vermand-Dauvières, adjacent to the battlefield of Somme, and featured hundreds of these black steel crosses, very haunting. And we were walking along the grounds, and in the back of the plot were a few stone markers, not steel crosses, but stone markers. And lo and behold, they had the Star of David on them. And sure enough, these were grave sites of Jewish German soldiers who fought and died side by side with Christian soldiers of the Imperial German Army. It's just staggering to think that 15 years later, the family of these fallen Jewish soldiers were subject to Nazi fascism, the Holocaust. And then you think of the irony when you bookend this with the American cemetery in Normandy, where 26 years later, the Jews fought side by side with their Christian brothers in the American Army and in the American Armed Forces as Jewish liberators of Europe. And so I just think that ironic bookend of that, the 26 years between the two cemeteries, the inclusion of the Jewish soldiers in the World War I cemetery for the Germans and the Jewish soldiers for the American Armed Forces in Normandy. So that's something that I'll always remember, the beauty of that and the irony of it.
Yes, that's a beautiful memory. I think we're all thankful to be here because of so many of those people who fought. We came out of the road trip not only enriched, but informed and happy and close. So it worked out in part because we worked to make it a good road trip. I really always will remember it with great fondness. Thank you so much, Cary, for sharing memories with us. Yeah, and I will always remember our trip.
And thank you, and much love to you and Bill, and thank you for a wonderful trip, and congratulations on your podcast too. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening to our award-winning podcast. We've recorded over 100 episodes of Places I Remember, so follow us on any podcast app. And new monthly episodes are also on YouTube with gorgeous video. My book, Places I Remember, is available in print and Kindle, and I read the audio version. Follow my travel writing at Forbes.com. Contact me at the links in the show notes or on my website, placesirememberlealane.com, and keep making your own travel memories.